guard and the needle guard is designed purely to stop you from bending this. Now these cost 25 quid. If you bend your needle, it's buggered and you need to get another one. So Harder and Steenbeck and every other airbrush company helpfully provide you with these lovely guards in various different forms. This is a standard guard. It strips into 2 points. You've got the rear of the guard, which hopefully will focus on it, and you can see the needle aperture here where it comes through, and the front of the guard, which is designed purely to stop us idiots from dropping it or knocking it when we put it into cases. The only section that really means anything is this section, the rear section, and many artists don't use the front section because their paint clogs a little bit on the front section. Again, their paint clogs because they might not necessarily know how to keep their paint working and thin. Over here we have the nozzle. So this is the area that the needle slides into. This is the locating area for the needle, and the nozzle lives inside the... It's hard to do this when you're looking through a camera. I'll look over. Lives inside the nozzle guard, and on the back is a washer to make it sealed, and on the front of the nozzle guard is a washer to make it sealed. Obviously we want to keep it air and liquid tight. So I'm just going to put this down over here for the time being. You can see the needle here is protruding from the airbrush, and you'll see when I use the trigger and I pull it back that the airbrush needle moves. Now it's not moving a lot because the depth gauge is set on this one because I just swapped it over. It's not set in the right location, but the needle will draw back. Mildly embarrassing. There we go. The needle will draw back quite a long way. So we're going to unscrew the paint cup. And that is as simple as what it sounds. It's just the bit that funnels the paint into the airbrush. This is a gravity-fed airbrush. There are two types of airbrush, gravity-fed and siphon-fed. For miniature painting, you do not want to use siphon-fed. Siphon-fed is pulled from underneath the airbrush. It doesn't work with small quantities of paint. It's for painting vehicles and canvases and walls and all that sort of side of things with large volumes of paint, unless you want to go through a pot of Vallejo or Games Workshop or Scale 75 paint every time you paint. Don't use a siphon feed airbrush. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to unscrew the back section, which leaves you the needle adjust and the needle adjusting or tightening collar. Now, all airbrushes, whether they're cheap or expensive, if you've taken them apart, will have a structure that looks similar to this. And that's really important to get your head around. For Harder and Steenbeck, they do make it idiot-proof, but if you're using a cheaper airbrush, you'll see the stuff I'm talking about will be very similar in the design of airbrush that you're using. We're then going to unscrew the body of the airbrush. And we're slowly going to withdraw the needle, because again, we don't want this needle. And this is a 0.2 needle, which is pretty much hypodermic in terms of its sharpness. We don't want this needle to get damaged in any way. This is the needle assembly, and in here we've got a whole load of springs, spring-mounted pistons, which allow you to use the trigger to pull the airbrush needle in and out. Obviously, if you withdraw the needle, it lets out paint. If you put the needle back in, it blocks the hole and the paint doesn't come out. It's pretty simple physics. If I unscrew this collar at the back here, I can pull the whole needle out of the assembly, but you literally never ever need to do that. That's just a pointless thing. If you take good care of your airbrush, you should be able to do this. Now I'm going to screw that rear section with the depth adjust back on. Excuse, that depth adjust is dirty, but never mind. And all this does is, on a standard airbrush, you can see I've marked it in two places. Which is a sets of depth, and it puts a little collar in the back here which stops that pin from going further back and therefore letting out too much paint. But if you take an airbrush apart, and it's a Harder and Steenbeck airbrush, that is as far apart as you need to take the needle. You literally unscrew the main body and you pull it out and you clean that bit at the front, and that's it, and that's brilliant. Looking at the main body again, you have a trigger assembly. Now on Harder and Steenbeck, unlike other airbrushes which come in multiple fiddly pain in the arse parts, it's a single piece. I could kiss the designers at Harder and Steenbeck for this. So you've got the spring torsion point, which is what puts pressure on the spring, which allows the trigger to be responsive. And then you've got the trigger itself and the needle aperture guide, and that's where basically the needle runs through the middle of that. The ball at the bottom presses in the pin in there, which allows the air to pass through. Now, in its simplest form, this is as far as you need to strip any Harder and Steenbeck airbrush ever. Main body, trigger assembly, nozzle and nozzle guard, and your needle. So let's look at how we look after it. We'll cover off cleaning in the next lesson. So this is how we maintain our airbrushes. So for this, for storage, like when you have an expensive sword or a knife, you oil it and you take good care of it. You do exactly the same with an expensive tool. You look after it and it will look after you. Ironically, I use Harder and Steenbeck airbrushes, but I think Iwata make the best airbrush lube. These are really cheap. They're like 4 or 5 quid, and that will last you for a million years. This is Iwata airbrush lube. So what I'm going to do to put this back together, because I've just cleaned this airbrush, is I'm going to take the lube and I'm going to put a tiny drop, just a bead like that, on the back of the airbrush nozzle, and I'm going to rub it all over willy-nilly with my finger. Doesn't matter. I'm going to pass it all around the nozzle, and then I'm going to slide it into the aperture, and I'm going to just use what's left as the remnants on my finger and slip it around the top of the nozzle guard. And all that does is put a tiny thin coat on this O-ring, which helps with the seal on the body when it contacts the body. And then I'm going to screw it in. Nice and tight. Done. Cheap airbrushes will come with spanners. You should never use a spanner to tidy or to tighten or loosen an airbrush. You'll break it. Do everything to finger tight. You don't need a spanner. Spanners are there for engineers, and if you use a spanner, you are a spanner. No offense, I'm only joking. Okay, so for the next section, you want to put a good blob of Iwata or any airbrush lube, other brands are available, on the needle, and you want to draw it upwards. Now, I know this looks phallic and it sounds stupid, but always draw away from you, because this is a hypodermic needle, and if you push downwards it will go clean through your finger. They are very sharp, and I don't care about your finger, but I do care about the expensive needle that you might damage. So let's put that safely up there. Next up, we take the trigger assembly, which is a lovely handy one piece, and we're going to put a little ball of lube on there and a little ball of lube in the middle, and I'm going to just waggle it around with my finger. And what that does is it lubes the ball, which connects the air piston, and it lubes the needle channel which the needle will pass through. So this is really fiddly on cheap airbrushes. With Harder and Steenbeck airbrushes, it just literally clips straight in, and you push it down a few times, and that will get the oil working or the lube working into the air compressor area. And you can see it just slips up and down nice and easily. And we're going to take our pre-lubed needle. We're going to depress the trigger. It's important to do this because you want to make sure the needle finds its natural route. You want to place the needle into the airbrush, and you should meet no resistance whatsoever. It should just slide straight in, and then you just move it a little bit until the square connecting pin comes in, and then you lock it up and you squeeze it tight. If we take off the front, now I'm all lubed up, this should be interesting. If we take off the front guard, you can see the needle protruding. And this is, in the next lesson, we'll cover off how an airbrush actually works, because this is getting quite long at 18.5 minutes. But you can see that the needle slides in and out completely to a recess with when the trigger pulls, and it's lovely and smooth. We're going to put the paint nozzle, there's the paint nozzle. The paint nozzle back on, and that is an airbrush fully taken apart and lubed. That's how you store your airbrush, just like you store a knife. Every time you finish using it, you take a little bit of time and you put it, after you've cleaned it, and you put some lube on it. And then if you are a ponce like me, you will have a very simple system of foam trays. And what I do is, and I will cover off cleaning and the idiot's guide to doing it, because it isn't difficult. In fact, it's really easy to clean an airbrush, but people overcomplicate it and damage things. I always put these airbrushes back in their assigned places. Here you can see the needle from an airbrush I'm currently working on. I'm currently working and I'm doing the Carol Dick's amazing Gorfang. Focus. Oh, okay, don't focus. I'm doing Carol's amazing Gorfang, and that's currently in for cleaning at the minute. It's being soaked. So this is the needle from that, which I've since cleaned off, and then I put it straight back into its foam tray to keep the needle safe, because we've covered off repeatedly how expensive the needle are. needles are. These little yellow things are nothing important. I'll cover off those in another lesson. Okay, so in terms of the anatomy of a basic airbrush, that's the lesson we've just gone through. Now I'm going to cut this one off at 20 minutes, and in lesson 2 we'll talk about how an airbrush actually works. These will probably only be 20 minutes at the time because of the time it takes YouTube to load them up, and I don't want to bore you all to tears. So I hope you enjoyed lesson 1 and you've learned something. Any comments or questions, stick them below. I will read them, but if you want to actually get a quick answer, just contact me on Facebook. And thank you very much for taking the time to listen to me waffle. Cheers.